Hello again. So we're looking at the IndiaFoxTecho MB339 from Yamaki, and this is a pretty cool machine. The Royal New Zealand Air Force operated this with 14 Squadron, a training squadron, in the MB339 Charlie Bravo or CB variant. Long since retired now though, so I've been flying this aircraft a little bit lately. It's actually not working that well in my sim, unfortunately, but others seem to be having more success. But in any case, it's quite a fun machine to blade around in, and I'll point out some of the issues I've had with it as we go. Well, they'll become apparent. As we can see, it's a light training aircraft. It's a tandem configuration, single engine. We've got wingtip tanks for fuel, and that's about it. Pretty simple. It's pretty rudimentary analog flight control instrumentation, and yeah, hydraulically boosted controls, but other than that, there's really not much to this airplane. We can see we've got pretty extensive flaps there and a speed brake which extends from the belly of the aircraft. So jumping on board, we've got our standard TAH directional indicator, airspeed on the left with mark on the inset, and altitude on the right. Vertical speed, there's a backup or standby attitude indicator. Angle of attack is quite a useful instrument we'll come back to. This is a nose trim or pitch trim indication. We can see the speed brakes and flap settings here. Engine instruments all through here. We have a bit of stuff for flight director, and this is a weapons armament panel which we won't be using, and really that's about it. There's a few other ancillary systems. This is a fairly primitive sort of GPS which is not implemented. It'll just show us whatever we programmed in the nav, basically in the map before we enter the aircraft. So the checks are pretty straightforward for an aircraft of this. Now, in real life, I don't have a lot of experience in this type of aircraft, although I have flown a couple of things that are similar. So essentially we can fire it up without too much trouble. We've got two generators, as you can see, and a standard and a backup AC power system. All of our emergency or abnormal systems will be indicating via this annunciator panel here, and so that's really our main reference during flight for any systems issues with the aircraft. And we've got a master caution up here. We can reset, light showing the canopies open, and nose wheel steering and anti-skid. So the steering illuminated green when nose wheel steering is on, and anti-skid indicated when anti-skid is off. That's about it really. Looking around, we've got just mostly radios. A lot of it's not implemented. The flap is on the outside of the throttle here, single power lever, and yeah, there's speed brake switches on the inside of the throttle there, so you'd use that with your thumb. Here's the anti-skid skid switch, which will turn on shortly. Lights showing the takeoff trim, so ailerons and rudder. They're illuminated green when they're in a neutral position for takeoff. Obviously landing gear handle. Here's the parking brake up here. It's called parking and emergency brake. So if your main brakes, toe brakes failed, then you would use this to modulate the braking using probably accumulator pressure during the rollout, and this is to lock the canopy. That's about it. So to fire it up, first we'd close the fuel or open the fuel shut-off valve there. There's a master switch for the engine control panel here, and there's a limiter function which we can turn on, and basically you hit the starter, and then once we reach a certain RPM, then you just bring this out of a gate and you'll get your light off. So here's our TGT. This is what we're looking for, the temperature inside the turbine. In fact, this looks like exhaust, so it depends. They vary. Obviously, you can have inlet turbine temperature, turbine inlet temperature. This one seems to be exhaust, so they're all done in slightly different ways. So what we'd be looking for is it seems to only have a N1, so a basically turbine or compressor speed. There's no N2, so once this gets up to maybe 15% or so, we'll introduce a fuel and look for the light off. So that's about it. So we'll hit our starter, and away she goes. So we should see this come off the stop, which it has. You can hear the sound. It's really just a standard sound. It's not tied to anything the airplane's actually doing. You can see through 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and looks like it's probably only going to go about as far as goes 14. Should get to 15. Okay, so we bring this out of the stop. Now we should get light off. So we can see we haven't really indicated fuel flow or TGT, so this is incorrect. We're finally getting fuel flow. We're finally getting some temperature into the engine. We'd expect to start a cutout around this point. Okay, looks like it's idling at about 42% and the engine's stable. Okay, so the engine's running, so now we'll turn on the electrical system. So generator's on, and we can see that all the lights have gone out except for aileron servo, which is aileron servo, I think it was. I have to find it. We've got a lighting panel down here, and pop that on. I have lights on steady, and the beacon go on now. This turns on this box, which doesn't seem to do much. Let me find this aileron servo. There it is there. Okay, so it's a guarded switch on the outside there. So this is basically going to be hydraulically boosted ailerons as far as I'm aware. Okay, we can set the flaps into the takeoff position. I think the reason, and correct me if I'm wrong, someone, but I think the reason that the aircraft's often left with the flaps in the extended position is because its hydraulic pressure is actually holding them up. So the weight of the surface, once you shut the engine down, the hydraulic pressure bleeds out of the system. Those surfaces will slowly droop. So by setting them into the down position, then you're not going to have sort of the hydraulic lock where the controls are sort of set in some intermediate position, or potentially they just drop down as well. So you're sort of extending them in the position so that the pressure can bleed off without them falling any further. And let's just check. We can see the speed brakes are extended, so we'll bring that in. And now we can close the canopy as well. So I think you hit, there's a touch spot here. Oops, that's our pin. So this would be the pin for arming the seat, the ejection seat here. And there's, we can lock that, so we can see that red mark's gone, showing that the canopy is locked. We can turn anti-skid on. So with anti-skid light should go out, and hasn't, and annunciator panel is clear. There's 3 switch positions here. Okay, that's gone out, and so the taxi light is on, and that's about it. So we're at Timaru Airport in New Zealand. This is NZTU, and we're on the main apron, so there's a taxiway Alpha to our right, which leads us out onto runway 0220. I've seen a few flashes of lightning around, so the intention is to get airborne and make our way towards Mount Cook aerodrome, which is out into the west. And if the weather's suitable, I'd like to actually just do a bit of a scenic flight around Mount Cook before a landing at the small strip at Mount Cook. So let's see how we go. As always, we'll just be making some decisions in real time depending on the conditions that we find. We've got quite a bit of gas. You can see that the fuel gauge in this thing is relatively complicated. There's a few different systems here. So this is showing this is the fuselage fuel, which is indicating at looks like just under 300 kilograms of fuel. We've got a little bit in each of the tip tanks, just under 100. And then there's pylon fuel, which we're not carrying any drop tanks on the pylons. So the total fuel is 557 kgs. So we'll leave it on. We'll put it on the tip tank, and that'll just show us as we go down. In the aircraft, these would be like push and release switches, but in the sim, of course, once you push it, it stays in until you push it again. So that's just probably a limitation of the sim. All right, that's about it. We do have pitot heat. You can see up here we've got these flagged indicators showing the engine pitot and AUA anti-icing. So we'll turn that on once we get onto the runway. So Timaru traffic. This is Delta Mike Oscar. Taxiing from apron flight Alpha to interbat track lineup runway 02. Track IR, get that organised. Parking brake goes off. Whoops. Later when that happens. We'll just lock that again. Okay. Just do a control sweep here. Okay. All clear. Brakes are checked. It's always a good idea to check the brakes fairly early in the piece, because if you find yourself checking the brakes later and they don't work when you actually need to use them, then you could be in trouble, right? So first thing we do is always check the brakes, so we make sure that we're not going to get too far down the track before we find out that we have a problem. There's a fairly high amount of thrust to taxi here. We always have what we call breakaway thrust, which is going to be slightly more to get the aircraft moving than to sustain it in the taxi. So it's just getting used to what is required for the aircraft, and of course that will vary with different weights as well. The heavier we are, the more thrust we need. Of course, surprise, surprise. Looks like some traffic down there, but impossible to know where it is. Does not appear to be here at Timaru. Can't see a windsock anywhere. So we'll use 02. See, we get quite a bit of roll as I do the turn there, which I'd be surprised if the real aircraft rolled so much in the taxi, to be honest. So the 339 is quite low to the ground, as we could see from that external view. It's quite a squat little airplane, but it's a pretty airplane, good visibility, particularly for the instructor in the back. One of the difficulties with tandem cockpit training aircraft like this is the visibility for the instructor is going to be obscured by the guy in the front. So this aircraft looks like it's got that pretty well dialed in, but unfortunately I don't think we can switch to the back seat. So we'll line up on the runway here. I'm only going to do a couple of things: turn that pitot heat on, check the lighting, and then we'll get underway. I'm just going to be hand flying the aircraft throughout here. There is this rudimentary autopilot and flight director which we won't be using. So the flaps are set, trim's all set. We've got our pitch trim here we talked about before. Pitot heat I will turn on here, I think it is. Okay, so it's pitot, and we can see that's pitot and AOA have changed to on. Alrighty. Flaps set. And there was lighting. We can move this landing light to on. Alright. I always like to have quite a zoomed out perspective here, because it's all of this peripheral stuff that I find so useful for my attitude flying. Okay, so the idea here is we basically bring it up. We don't have to go to full power, but we'll certainly give it a lot of power. See that? I just moved the throttle and left it there, and you saw we got this big overshoot, which is pretty unrealistic. So now we can see that everything's stable, door pressure's in the green, brakes released, and we'll go to full power because we've got our limiter on. Okay, I'm going to rotate at about 130 knots, and we should unstick at about 150. See the steering light goes out automatically there at about 30 knots. Okay, there's rotate, so just ease the stick back and I'm just going to hold it. Okay, we've already broken ground, brakes checked, gear travels, flaps go up, so we can see the gear travelling, flaps are travelling up. It's 200 knots, gear is up, and a set a climb attitude of about 18 degrees or so, at around 200 knots. So we can see that we've got a very high climb rate here, so it's quite a bit of performance even for a light training aircraft. It's a big step up if you've only been flying turboprops or light aircraft. If this is your first aircraft, say the military, first jet aircraft, it's a massive performance leap. Things tend to happen pretty quickly. We're all clear to the right. We'll start a left turn here. Just lower the nose slightly. And we're just over 250 knots. So I'll bring the power back. We'll just keep around 250 knots while we get ourselves organised here. Through traffic, Delta Mike Oscar. It's airborne with 5,000 feet to the north, and we'll be tracking west. Okay, so we can see, unlike typical AHUC in the Western aircraft, the angle of bank is indicated at the bottom here. So we can see here's our 30-degree mark. This is 45. So rather than looking for it at the top, we're looking for it at the bottom. And the other thing I've noticed about this aircraft is there's no lubber line on the directional indicator there, so we sort of assume that it's here, but it's not clearly indicated. Even if I zoom in a bit, it's just a bit of a scratch there, but it's not a clear line like you can see there's some other ones here. but that's not really indicated very clearly. Okay, so the airfield's back below us there. A little bit of traffic around, so we're in an Airbus up high. It's not going to affect us. 172 out here. So essentially from Timaru, the Southern Alps where we're heading is just all the way into the west there, across the other side of the ranges. So we'll just quietly make our way under this cloud, and we'll climb up to the cloud base shortly. You can see there's a few holes. Maybe we'll actually just climb up through one of these holes, get a bit of altitude, and then we should be able to see where we're going. Quite useful in aircraft is we've got a ground speed gauge here, and as I said, it does actually show us where we're going. So this shows the wind, of course, and it's just got an arbitrary number, steer point 3, which is, it's just a dummy sort of figure there to make you think you've got a navigation system in a jet, but it's just set for Mount Cook. So it's showing 52 miles at 280, and here's our wind, and then we get our steer point 3 showing the time to go is 11:26 in minutes and seconds, and that's the ground speed. So we could follow the 280 bearing, and that'll get us to Mount Cook eventually. So if we want to get above this cloud here, we just need to manage it so that we actually make it through the hole. But we've got good green air underneath the cloud here. You can see those ridge lines pretty clearly, so I think I'm just going to stay at this level for the time being and make our way through there. We can increase the speed shortly. Just getting the trim organised here. Oops. Just turn the oxygen on. I just noticed we didn't have an oxygen flow indicator. That was my bad. This is a gun sight. Of course, it's not active in the sim. So we see our angle of attack gauge. Now this is angle of attack gauge is a very useful instrument because essentially it just tells us what the wing is doing at any given time. And by doing, I guess I mean the wing has a maximum amount of lift that it can produce at any given time. Okay, and so this is generally considered in terms of a unit. So 1 being the maximum amount of lift that the wing can produce. If we exceed 1, the angle of attack of 1, then the wing will stall. So we have a few different indications on the outside of the instrument. So there's one here at around 0.5 to 0.41 or so. So this is normally indicated as like an optimum angle of attack for say approach probably. You can see there's a couple of other tick marks, so we seem to be in like a cruise setting here. This could be like a max endurance, and this will be just approaching this stall up here as well. So when we're landing and taking off or operating at high levels, then the AOA can become quite a useful instrument for setting optimum pitch attitudes and things like that. Okay, so everything's settling down pretty nicely here. Let's see, we're doing just over 250 knots indicated at 80% RPM, so we've got quite a bit more power that we can apply. Just always keeping an eye on the weather situation. Obviously heading into rising terrain with a bit of cloud and some thunderstorms around. We definitely want to be on the lookout. And so by keeping the speed back, it also just gives us that bit of extra time. But it doesn't seem to be too windy. That was 321 at 10 knots, so pretty light winds. We're only 9 minutes from Mount Cook here, so I think what we'll do now, just to make it a bit more interesting, is we'll do a left turn and fly down the right hand side of this valley here, and we'll just increase the speed and drop down to a lower level. We don't have a radio altimeter in the aircraft, so we'll just start a left turn. Aircraft like this, really, you want to just set an attitude and be fairly precise with what you're doing. So there's the entrance to the valley, roll wings level. We'll just let the nose fall and accelerate into the valley. So I'll be looking for about 300 knots. Now, as you can see, what I've found is there's a lot of instability in pitch in this model. So if I wobble my stick here, we get this commensurate wobbling of the aircraft. So essentially it shows that there's no inertia whatsoever. In the real aircraft, I should be able to push the stick and the response is not going to be quite instantaneous, and there'll be a bit of inertia to wobble out of sync with my actual movement of the stick. Now in a aerobatic aircraft like an extra or a pit special monoplane, you get that kind of response, but even though this is a small jet, it's still quite a big bit of metal, and there's no way that it would respond quite as directly as that. So I find that a little bit of a disappointment with the flight model, is it just makes the handling a bit unrealistic. So I'm sticking on the right hand side of the valley, just like I have done in other videos in the VL3, and I forget what else I've flown, the 172. So I've got room on the left if I want to get out of this valley where it's closed. And so it's giving me options. Now I can always climb, that's probably my best option when I've got the power that I do in a jet like this. But I'm always keeping plenty of options open, so I could reverse back around to the left if I really had to. I could go out of here and back down that other valley in the distance. So you can see we're getting that wobbling around. Now it has been reported as a bit of a bug, this very sensitive wobbling, which seems to be a bit of a function of the turbulence modelling in the sim, which, while I've found it really quite cool in some of the other aircraft, it seems to feel a little excessive in this aircraft here. So I do believe we are getting close to, yeah, unfortunately I can't remember the names of these passes, so I'm not even going to pretend to know what it is. I want to say that's Geraldine, but I don't think it is. I should have my VFR map up, but I don't have it up today. So we can see that there's pretty clear low-lying valleys that lead us through into what's called the Mackenzie Basin, which will take us all the way into the Power Lake region here. So I think I mentioned on the video flying from Queenstown to Alexandra, we flew over the Clyde Dam, that New Zealand's primary source of power generation is from hydroelectric dams, and some of the power lakes up here in the sort of central part of the South Island. And so we'll be flying towards this region now. You see some power lines that, yeah, they are modelled actually. So these are all coming from the power stations out in the middle of the Mackenzie Basin here. So looking at this cloud, yeah, we definitely won't get up into the Alps under the cloud because it's pretty grey in the distance there. So we'd have to climb up above that cloud. Because we're flying VFR, that limits our options somewhat. So it would be just have to really manage that. And looking at that flashes of lightning through there, it doesn't look like the greatest day to be stooging around in the mountains. But you can see this is a wonderful area. I've flown through here in real life in a Piper Cup many years ago, and a little bit lower than this, obviously a lot slower. And yeah, I was just a trainee pilot back then, but it was just a huge amount of fun. You can see this canal here, so there's these canal systems that link up the dams for, or the lakes for the power stations. And how we're tracking, so it's 299 and 20 miles to Mount Cook. And we're on 270 or so. We can actually change that to RNAV and we get our distance here. But our course setting won't work because it's based on the original track from Timaru. So that will only centre if we're on the original track. We're well south of that now. So we're flying to deteriorating weather. I've still got just under 300 knots indicated. 300 over the ground, so not much wind around. And we know we need to start moving towards the north. So this is where we just need to start keeping our wits about us. We always want to have our option to turn back. We know the weather's good behind us, but the further we go along here, the more we start to paint ourselves into a corner. And we can see that that's not looking good at all. So I'm going to reduce the speed here, just give us a slightly reduced turning radius and a bit more time to decide what we're going to do. It looks like a pretty clear line over that ridge. So if we were to cross that ridge, we need to be comfortable that we can make it back out. So we've still got a good clear passage of air to the right if we want to escape from this. So I need to keep that option open. We're just coming back towards 200 knots. Just because we've got the rising horizon, we can see that we're actually climbing. So this is also something to be aware of, that you can be looking at this ridge line here, not really noticing that you are flying into rising terrain and you're climbing with it, and your speed will be decaying and you'll end up running out of power. But we're up on another plateau here actually. So for now, I think we'll just keep making our way along here. We've still got our out to go back the other way. We've got plenty of room to turn back around to the left. That looks like a lake on our left there. That could be Lake, it's either going to be Lake Pukaki, I'm pretty sure. Bring up our map here and have a look. Okay, so this is actually Lake Tekapo, this is Lake Pukaki. So we're heading to the head of Lake Pukaki, and we can see Mount Cook's here. There's a little airstrip here called Glen Tanner. Mount Cook itself, the highest mountain in New Zealand, is just up in here. So very poor conditions indeed. Now things are just starting to get marginal, and again we can see we've got a rate of descent because we've lost our horizon. So now we know that we're sort of capped at the top. It's starting to rain, so visibility is reducing. So now we just need to really think carefully about where we are and what we're doing and what we're going to do next. So managing the speed is obviously important because we need to give ourselves time. So we've got plenty of room here still to maneuver in this sort of flat area as the glaciers feed down into the top of Lake Pukaki. And we can see the terrain is on either side of this valley. So as long as we remain within this valley and give ourselves the room to turn around, then we're still in good shape. See the road underneath us which leads up to Mount Cook. So Mount Cook Airdrome, it's really just a small airstrip. It's located up in this area here, but the visibility is very poor and there's pretty much a dead end on both sides. So the valley forks to go to the west or the east, or northwest, northeast, and they both climb up into glaciers into the mountains, so they're really dead ends on each side there. So it's also relatively one way, so we could land, that might be the strip coming to view there, so we could land in this direction, but if we have to go around, we're flying into this big wall of soup. But the thing about poor visibility is it's not a wall, it sort of feels that way because we can't see beyond our line of visibility, but as we move forward that tends to move with us. Of course, if visibility is decreasing, that's not going to be the case. So we're sort of approaching a bit of a shower here, so I just really want to have a bit of a sniff around here, just see how far we can see. I've got good green air all around here, so I'm comfortable. We've got our out, and I just want to see if this opens up a bit as we get further north here, bearing in mind that of course I'm getting close to that ridge. So we'll just do an S-turn here to increase our track miles over the ground. And okay, so we can see this is the point where the valleys head off in each direction, and we should see the airfield up in here somewhere. Some buildings. Okay, there's the runway. Okay, so we can actually see the airport there, and there's enough room in this basin or this part of the valley head to allow us to turn around. So I think we can do that. If we make a hard right turn now, we'd get out, but we can see we've got rising terrain here, whereas it widens out here. So this, you can see what I mean. The visibility is moved with us, and we can actually see the airfield pretty clearly there. What I'm just conscious of is the wind direction, but we can really only go one way. So not an unusual day for the mountains. Alright, so we can make our way around the corner here. I'm just going to reduce the power and lower the flaps as we come around the corner here, because we can keep an eye on our angle of attack. So this will just show us how much we're asking of the wing, how close we're getting to the stall speed. See, visibility's dropped quite a bit, and we don't have that horizon, so we have to be very careful not to climb or descend. Okay, the airport's just up here, so it's pretty unconventional because of the terrain and the visibility. The only way we can really make it into this runway is by heading back out and doing a figure of 8. Really go out this way and then with a left turn back into final. You can see visibility's opening up. I'm still anxious to see a windsock if I can. It would just be nice to know exactly what the wind's doing. What's it say here? So it's certainly northerly, but there's actually not much wind to speak of. So I think we can try and make an approach anyway. So we'll bring that speed back a bit further. We'll travel the gear and set the first stage of flaps. So the flaps are travelling. The gear is down a lot. Okay, now we really need to monitor our speed through this turn. We have very few options in the event of a go-around, so it's important to keep our speed up, and if we do go around, it'll be important to make that decision fairly early. Keep the speed low and use all of that basin. Very nice. Okay, you can see we've just got a bit slow, so we'll keep it coming around the turn here. You see I've got a yellow mark there at about 140 knots, so it's probably a good place to stay, 150, 140. The airport's just on the north side of the river. We can see our angle of attack here, just sitting in this approach range. Pretty sure that's the runway here, but because of this visibility we can't be sure, and because of this terrain feature here we can't make a really long final. We'll just have to come in on a bit of an angle and straighten up as we get closer. But if you've seen from my earlier video, one of the earlier ones flying into Foxpine, where I talked about the trees on approach, so you know, we've done this stuff before. When you're flying on sort of different airstrips around the place, then this is the sort of approaches that you just have to make. It's not always going to be the textbook. Obviously watching we don't hit this terrain feature, we're getting a bit of turbulence off it. Travelling full flaps now. Now looking to line up on the runway. Okay, there it is there, just coming out of the Merc. I was actually lined up pretty well and I took us off track. Okay, so we're going to aim for the touchdown end of the runway here. And I've got speed brakes, so it's obviously pretty steep here, so I'm just going to put a bit of speed brakes out. And that's probably a good profile now. I'm actually applying power just to help arrest that rate of descent. And it's not a long runway, so we're aiming to plonk it down right at the end. Okay, and we just close the throttle check. Okay, speed brakes travel. Brakes. Okay, there's the windsock at last. Obviously I wasn't aligned with the centre line, but given the conditions I will take that, and you can see we actually managed to bring that up pretty nicely in time for the taxiway. So alright, very cool. So even though that was fairly tight in terms of the approach and poor weather and mountainous terrain and a relatively high performance aircraft, yeah, we can do that relatively stress-free by always having a backup plan and just managing the situation. I'm going to turn around on the runway here, and in these sorts of winds we could actually take off in the other direction, but I think on a wet runway with a tailwind and a jet like this, I think I'll prefer to have the wind on the nose, and we'll manage that turn back because we know that we can achieve it. This outer roll in the taxi is a bit disconcerting. There's probably only 3 or 4 knots, certainly less than 5 tailwind. But on a wet runway we tend to avoid taking any tailwind at all, because if we have to stop and abort the takeoff, then it's going to be a bit hairy to high-speed abort with a tailwind on a wet runway, very likely to go off the end of the runway. Okay, so I've reset the flaps or the takeoff position. You can see the trim is set slightly nose up, which is fine. So while we need full power for the takeoff, of course, the trick, the challenge here is getting that power off and managing the speed. So we need to get airborne and up to our 200 knots and then use that as our manoeuvring speed to get out. So I'm just going to have to be conscious of avoiding getting too quick here, because our radius of turn will be too high otherwise, and we'll need really steep angle of bank, which will in turn increase our angle of attack and make the chances of stalling in the turn that much higher. So we could use all of that runway if we really wanted to, but I think we'll get off without too much trouble. So we're just going to line up and have a talk about what the intention is here. Using a combination of differential braking and nose wheel steering to get us around the corner. It's actually quite tricky. And as I've mentioned before as well, my chair, it's got wheels on a hard surface, so when I push the pedals, I tend to push myself away from the table, so I just have to factor that into my steering as well. Alright, so funnily enough, I've actually been in this precise situation in real life in a Gulfstream out of here once upon a time, and it was not ideal. In fact, these conditions are probably a bit worse than they were on the day that I was there. But yeah, it's not ideal, so it doesn't look like they're getting any better either. So this ridgeline here gives me the confidence to do this, because that's really my key terrain feature. So you can go this way, which of course is a dead end. Mount Cook's up the end here, so there's no options there. We've got a lot more room in this direction, although because of this visibility limit that we can't really see how far we can go, but we can see this ridge here. So we've got, well, it's hard to say, probably 3 miles of visibility, so it's actually quite a lot. And we know that we just turned around inside here at the same speed we're going to take off at. So the intention then is just to get airborne, avoiding this terrain feature initially, extending as far as we can before the vis gets too poor, and then making our right turn back out this way. I may even keep the flaps down. We'll just see how that feels, to be honest. The flickering here is an issue. And then head back out to the good vis down the valley. And yeah, we'll see how it looks, whether we want to find a hole and climb up and see if we can see the mountains from the top, or perhaps head back to Timaru. Looks like we've used all of our tip fuel. So we've got 342 kilograms of fuel left there, which doesn't correlate with that needle actually. So I'm not really sure why that number differs from what it's indicating there. But in any case, we've got some gas, so as I did before, on the brakes, bring the power up initially. Let's get this big overshoot, which is a bit unrealistic. Okay, full power there, brakes released, away we go. The speed's alive. Plenty of room on this runway for us. There's 130 rotating. Brake skier travels. We'll keep the flaps. And obviously we can't climb too much either. So as I said, I'm extending towards this ridge line, keeping this one in sight, making sure I'm not flying too far into the dead end. Okay, there's 200 knots, so I'll leave the flaps out, reduce the power, so maintain 200 knots. And we can see that line of visibility, it's really just stopped there. So before I fly into the cloud, we need to keep that ridge in sight, keep an eye on the attitude, make sure that we're not descending too much in this turn. See our angle of attack's good. Going to travel the flaps there. We're still inside this ridge, heading back towards the airfield. And we've accelerated up to 250 through that turn. Now we just need to maintain clear of cloud as we exit the valley back into the clear air over Lake Pukaki. Alright, so that worked out pretty well. You can already see it lightening up around us. So I'll increase the power and get a bit of speed so we can head towards this clear air out here. So you can see it can be managed as long as we have a plan and we stick to it. and we're ready to adapt as necessary. So the gear is up and the flaps are up. Alright, look at that, we're out of the weather, it's cleared up nicely. Unfortunately we can't use this to reprogram a different waypoint. All we can do is probably set. I think Timaru has a navigation aid, but I'd have to look up the frequency for that, which I can't be bothered doing, but we can probably get ourselves back there if we need to, or when we need to. Just being cognizant of the fact that we don't have a whole lot of fuel left now. In fact, we don't really have enough to climb up above this cloud and see if we can see the mountains at the top. Alright. We've also got the airport of Tekapo, which we will have a quick look at now on the way out of here. So Tekapo is, this is Lake Tekapo. Tekapo is a little township here. And there's a little airport here, which is, I've actually got a custom scenery here. It's not sort of based on the real airport, to be honest. It's a very rudimentary version, which just adds a little bit of personality to the place, but we can do a quick overflight of that. I took the Mackie, this aircraft, in there the other day, so it can be done, but it's a smaller runway than Mount Cook, where we've just come from. But it's taking us in approximately the right direction. You see we've got good clear air ahead. Sun on the hills is always a good sign. You can see at this sort of fairly high speed cruise, we're still getting 330 odd knots indicated and 370 ground speed there, so that's a pretty good aeroplane as far as what we have in the sim by default. One of the few payware aircraft out there. This is probably the only one that gives you the sort of flexibility to zip around and make sure short work of the distances between places. I'm just looking for the Tekapo airfield. Should be up here somewhere. I think it might be just here. There's the runway. Okay, there it is. As I said, this is a freeware add-on airport you can get for the region. We're pretty close, but we can sort of drop down a bit. Okay, the reason that we do an inverted sort of pull like that is to keep the G's positive. If we just pushed over, then we would be putting quite a bit of negative G on, which is not only uncomfortable, but not all aircraft cope with it very well. And it also allows us to keep the location in sight where we're heading to. So we can see the airport there. Alright. So now we just need to pick a way forward to get home. So there's a valley up there we could potentially go through, or we could go straight ahead. I think straight ahead's good because fuel is our biggest issue now. So we will just pop up over this terrain feature. Yeah, there's a big break in the cloud above us, which if we had a bit more gas we'd be able to climb up through there without too much trouble. Okay, we can see a valley through here, so we'll aim for that. So the reason we also use really high angular bank is, you see, as soon as we hit that angular bank, the wings aren't producing lift to keep us up anymore. The lift has been moved into the sort of that horizontal plane, so it allows the nose to drop. So without having to push, watch out for the power lines. So if I just hold that angular bank and let go, there's more. The nose will just drop of its own accord. I don't have to push or pull or use rudder or anything. So it's the quickest way to get the nose down to the horizon is to increase the angular bank. Okay, we can just stick on to the southern side or the right hand side of this valley. we are going to have to start tracking east because the airport's in that direction. We've got our white line, so we can see where we're heading to. So we'll probably just break through here and make our way back to Timaru once we get into this area here. And you can see at these sorts of speeds, you're covering quite the ground pretty quickly. So your decision making needs to be pretty quick. You don't have a lot of time to get lost. We'll turn inside this terrain feature here, over this little ridge. All clear. So pretty much once we get a beam to the airfield, then we know it's a straight east track to get there. So that's my intention, is really just to intersect a easterly track straight into the airport, and then we'll arrive there for the break into the pattern overhead. Fuel's good, just over 200 kilograms. So we're only about 5 or 6 minutes away from the airport now by the looks. Let's keep a good lookout. One thing I did do, might have been yesterday, was just look for other traffic, other players, and see if I could sneak up behind them and just join a formation. I joined a formation with a TBM 930 for a little while, which was good fun. I'm not sure if that's upsetting the person that I was formating on. And obviously if they don't have this aircraft, then I'm not sure how it's actually depicted in the sim for them. So presumably they don't see the model. So if you've been flying in New Zealand the last few days and some madman man has been tearing around trying to formate on you, then it was probably me. Alright, so now we can see we're pretty much been the airfield. It's on the coast here. So we're already tracking east actually. So I think this track's probably pretty good. We're just under 4,000 feet. So the airfield is pretty close to sea level. So we'll begin a descent as we cross this ridge here. Back into the Canterbury region. So Canterbury itself, this whole region up to Christchurch is very flat. It's called the Canterbury Plains. It's also quite dry, so you get all the moisture that collects and accumulates on the west coast of the Southern Alps, the big line of mountains we just came from. And it tends to be quite hot and dry on the eastern side over here, with lower rainfall and a warm northwest breeze which dries the place out and gives people headaches. A slight correction to the left. And I'll begin that descent down to 1,000 feet for the break. Once we get the airport inside, I know that I think it's 0220, so we'll just adjust our track to start a base to join a final for 02, and we'll descend down into the break with the left-hand brake into the downwind. And yeah, we'll do that, try and do that similar speed to this, around 350 knots. Yeah, so the airfield should be just out here somewhere. Looks like the town, so the airport should be on there it is there, okay, in sight. So we're set up nicely for a final onto the break. So the idea with this, I'm no professional sort of military pilot to be conducting this procedure, but essentially we'll do 1,000 feet down the strip. Once we get to the far end of the runway, we will make a hard left turn, speed brakes will go out with power idle. As we decelerate through to 250 knots, we will go flaps and gear and set up for the same speeds, about 160 knots, and we'll just keep that going all the way into final. We just have to correct ourselves on the final there. Coming up on 1,000 feet. Feels like a bit of crosswind in this position. So we're just lined up to the right of the runway, which is not a bad thing actually. Okay, 350 knots. And into the brakes, so power idle. Speed brakes travel. Climbing into that circuit. As the speed comes back, gear travels. Flaps, speed brakes in, and there's 1,000 feet, so we'll just catch the altitude. Okay, we're probably a little wide, it's fine. Okay, there's 160 knots, increase the power, beam the touchdown zone. Just keeping that turn going now with the descent, and I'm just trimming those up, bit of power. About halfway through this I'll go to full flap. Okay, so gears down 3 greens. Okay, it's full flap. Slow AOA is good. Bit high, so I'm just reducing the power. Airway is a bit high there. Rolling out, try and get the center line. Okay, paddle idle. Check. Nope. Loaded. We made it though. Brakes. Alright, so we floated unfortunately. My bad, so I should have checked, but I already flared. But we made it back in one piece. We got just under 200 kilograms of fuel, so good times. We'll travel the flaps up, speed brakes are in. Yeah. Alright, so yeah, here we are. There's a little introduction to the MB339. As you can see, it's a good fun aircraft to blade around. Didn't notice too many issues with it this time, to be honest. I have found the sort of the wobbling effect, but it was pretty smooth today, pretty smooth. So clearly the winds are relatively light, so maybe that is the main reason why it's so wobbly. But introduced, as I normally do, a bit of real-time decision-making flying in poor weather. But we've got good visibility in an airplane like this, which does make our life a bit easier. So I'll sign off here. You don't need to see the whole shutdown. I recommend getting out there and buying the aircraft. There's various platforms you can get through. I got mine through Burkes. And yeah, we'll see you at the next